This presentation reviews the vocabulary you need to discuss art. The terms can be divided into two groups, the visual elements and the principles of design, but ultimately they all help us discuss the formal properties of a work of art. You'll note that none of these words is composition. That's because these are the words that help you describe the overall composition or certain parts within the composition. Moreover, these terms alone don't indicate whether a work is naturalistic or not. Naturalistic means closer to nature, and close synonyms for this word include realistic, veristic, mimetic, and others. Later in the lecture, I will qualify these terms to talk more explicitly about naturalism. The first term is line, and it has a very literal meaning. In fact, training artists will frequently be asked to do a line drawing, or contour drawing, in which your pencil marks trace the contours or edges of an object, as has been done in this drawing of a wine glass. Describing a work of art often includes talking about the quality of a line, and here you can see how the varying thickness creates a very different effect and even gives a better sense of dimensionality. This is because light rarely hits objects so evenly, and our eyes begin to intuit a three-dimensional object when the line varies in this way. You can observe this same effect in another line drawing, how your impression changes when the contour line varies only in thickness. You should be aware that compositions, whether developed around a series of line drawings, here with a highly varied and expressive line, or around fully dimensional, more realistic pictures, might have an implied line. Here, there is no drawn line that traces the curve from the bottom left to the upper middle right and over to the top left, but your eye instinctively follows this visual path, thus creating an implied line. The flowing nature of the visual path in this line drawing creates a sense of movement in the composition, but don't confuse directional movement, which applies to a visual path or motion within the composition, to the idea of movement as the illusion of real-life action. For example, if you look at these two statues, Myron's Discobolus from ancient Greece and Bernini's David from the Baroque period, you will observe that one has a much stronger sense of naturalistic movement than the other. Although Bernini's figure is much more anatomically convincing with regard to his pose, and thus conveys a better sense of the action of hurling an object that is about to take place, there are formal reasons this sense of movement is stronger as well. In the Discobolus, the figure, or really the composition, since the composition consists of the figure, is pressed into a kind of semicircle. Even the counter arc is so carefully balanced with the primary arc that the figure remains quite stable. In fact, the figure is so stable and carefully, almost elegantly balanced on the ground that, even despite the implied movement, it's almost a static statue. Bernini's work, on the other hand, dispenses with stabilizing geometric components like circles, equilateral triangles, or straight verticals and horizontals. Instead, he creates a dynamic work of art that is more precariously balanced on a diagonal. The primary arc veers off to one side as it twists its way from bottom to top. The secondary arcs continue the twisting and turning in more organic ways that create a spiraling effect, just the action necessary in real life to hurl the projectile with the necessary force. Although Bernini's work is balanced in a similar way to the Discobolus, as marble must be in order to stand upright without breaking off, the emphasis on arabesques optically creates a sensation of twisting and turning that doesn't need to rely only on what we know about the anatomical possibilities of our waists. Another visual element is form. For 2D objects, we might think of these as shapes, and for 3D objects, we might think of this as mass or volume. In compositional terms, we can always refer to shapes, even in paintings that give the illusion of mass, or in sculpture in the round. However, we should be aware that the sense of mass that a sculpture has as an object, beyond a canvas on a frame, has a more specific meaning. In any case, forms, like lines, may be implied. Here we recognize the rabbit's head as a complete form, even though it's not a closed shape, and it lacks any shading that would make it identifiable as a 3D head. Here, a simple line drawing offers enough recognition. Likewise, the body is formed by a Chinese character, but together with the head, we would call this form the rabbit. You could even talk about the front legs of the rabbit as black forms rather than lines due to their thickness. It's all relative as long as your discussion of the artwork is cohesive. Between forms of any sort there is a space. The areas that we perceive as blank may be referred to as negative space. The more abstract or even simplified that a drawing is, the more confusion is possible between negative spaces and positive forms. In fact, you may see this drawing as cheap profiles facing one another, or you may see it as an intricate vase or goblet. This well-known illusion is less straightforward than most artworks will be, but it highlights the way we conceive of form and space. Color refers to hues. In this painting by Mondrian, you can see his typical preference for primary colors, red, yellow, and blue. But when it comes to color, don't confuse hue and value. I'll discuss value more specifically in a moment, and it can also have an effect on color. But colors can be desaturated without any lightening or shading. They can be desaturated through mixing with other colors. Thus, color, in the sense of hue, can be said to have either a high or low intensity due to the purity of the color. The most vibrant red, for example, will not be mixed with any other color. Good discussions on color might include awareness of the line versus color dichotomy in Western art. Dating back to the Renaissance and gaining renewed prominence in the 19th century, a debate emerged about which element should be primary, line or color. In 19th century France, classicists like Ingres chose line, while romantics like Delacroix chose color. One might assume that a colorist always has more brilliant colors, but if you compare these two works, you'll notice that's not particularly true. Here, Ingres has used a cool palette, but his colors are brilliant. Delacroix has chosen a warm palette, but his colors are equally brilliant. So the colorist label is primarily assigned to those who paint with a looser brushstroke, that's to say, those who construct the picture with color, rather than by filling in precise outlines. This detail from another painting by Delacroix shows particularly well how colors for shading are applied in direct brushstrokes and not blended smoothly away. Besides using more carefully blended colors and creating a smooth, glossy surface, Ingres is said to have a purity of line, which means that the contours are prominently and often elegantly rendered, even when forms look less naturalistic, and give unity to the composition as a whole. Two further details by the same artists show once again how color is a more activating principle in Delacroix's painting. Water droplets are rendered with colors that are distinct from the object, skin, on which they appear. You'll notice that Ingres uses a much purer blue, a purer yellow, etc. Delacroix not only constructs his painting through color, but he also mixes different colors much more liberally in order to create vivid contrasts, and in a move that prefigures the Impressionists or Pointillists, lets the viewer's eyes themselves mix the colors, just as they do in real life. Value refers to how much light or dark there is, and in absence of color, the scale ranges from white through all the grays to black. What does value typically do in a 2D work? As you see here, it can be used to give the work a three-dimensional quality. It makes objects look like they exist in real space. The artists make objects rendered on a 2D surface appear to have volume, or mass. This process of adding lights and darks to give the illusion of volume or mass is called modeling. To say that an artist modeled her figures would be to say that she used value, or light and dark, to give them mass. Another key term is chiaroscuro, and similarly, it means the use of strong lights and darks. Literally, chiaro means light in Italian, and scuro means dark. Please note that tints and shades, or adding white or black, also change the hue, making them more or less bright, vibrant, or saturated. The addition of gray dulls the hue. Please also note that sculptures intrinsically have no values. Any values are generated from the way the light hits the actual surface of the carved object, and so the values may change in different lighting. Hence, when we talk about modeling in sculpture, we mean the literal act of forming or shaping an object, like clay in our hands. Texture refers to the surface quality of something. In 2D work, we're usually talking about an illusion of texture. Even abstract lines can seem smooth or rough, but you could also say that in a certain painting, a porcelain vase looks smooth and a rock looks rough. Of course, the actual surface of the painting can be literally smooth if the artist has carefully blended all the materials with a fine brush, or it can be rough or bumpy if he has applied brushwork thickly. Similarly, a sculpture can be illusionistically or literally smooth. In this detail of a sculpture by Bernini, the marble is literally smooth as the surface has been carefully and finely polished, but the reality of hard stone, though smooth, contrasts with the illusion of soft, supple skin. This more modern sculpture represents a human figure, but the artist is not concerned with creating the illusion of human skin. He is more interested in the surface qualities or textures that are unique to the medium of marble. To the touch, the sculpture would be rough, although we can certainly see that without touching it. Returning to Bernini's sculpture of David, we see also the elements of time and motion. I already discussed motion at length, but we can add that there is a sense of implied time here as well. We understand that, since the figure is in action, things will change from one second to the next. This is not a static pose, but a movement frozen in time. Usually only in contemporary art do we have objects or installations that deal with time and motion in a very literal way. Design has to do with the artwork as a whole. You can talk about color or line or form just by seeing a detail of a work of art, for example, but you won't know where the focal point is unless you see the entire thing. The focal point, or point of emphasis, is the thing that stands out the most. In this painting by Jacques-Louis David, the focal point is where the hand holds the three swords at the top center of the composition. It's not just because this is the middle of the canvas. Strong diagonals create a visual path towards this gesture at the center. Moreover, the dark negative space surrounding the highlighted palm and swords causes them to stand out. Unity, or harmony, is another principle of design. It means that there is a sense of things belonging together in an aesthetic whole. Here, there are several elements that create a sense of unity. The harmonious color palette consisting of earth tones, the use of similar forms, and a consistent simplification of form and color, among other things. Contrast is what creates interesting differences within a composition. However, just because something is different doesn't mean that the work lacks unity. In this simple design, although there is only one green shape, it is the same size and shape as all the rest. If it had been a circle or a straight-edged triangle, it would have looked much more out of place. The artist kept it the same to preserve a stronger sense of unity. It is contrast here, however, that creates a clear focal point or emphasis to this design. Returning to David's painting, there are several ways to find contrast, but perhaps the most noticeable is between the masculine left side and the feminine right side of the painting. On the left, solidity, straightness, uprightness, rigidity, and robustness are the formal elements that reinforce the sense of determination, strength, and energy conveyed by the information we determine from the facial expressions and postures of the men. On the right, curves, limpness, languor, delicacy, and the lack of uprightness reinforce the sense of sadness and resignation among the women. The painting is nonetheless balanced, mostly by a sense of equal distribution of weight. The three women and two small children on the right have approximately the same visual weight as the men on the left. There is one figure in the center. The background architecture, comprised of three arches that organize the three parts of the composition, is symmetrical and helps balance the composition overall, but it really is about weight more than symmetry. In this design, you can see that one large circle on the lower right has a similar mass to the various smaller circles of varying size on the upper left. There is unity in the circular shape and color. There is contrast in the size and number of objects, but there is balance in visual weight. Rhythm is achieved through repetition, or the patterned recurrence of similar elements, be they lines, forms, colors, or any others. Like a drum beat which makes you want to move, the repetition of visual elements creates a kind of optical tapping of your foot, and you might feel the urge to describe a painting with strong rhythmic elements, whether fluid or staccato, with physical gestures. We could bring back our composition on balance to talk about scale or proportion. As we mentioned, one circle is much bigger than the others, and you could certainly measure it and find the proportion of one circle to another, but scale often becomes more pertinent in representational art, where we can determine things like spatial relationships based on the size of an object. The larger image here plays with the idea of scale by juxtaposing the New York skyline at one scale and the hand at another, but having them interact with one another. The elements and principles don't include a few key terms that help explain what makes something look more naturalistic. First of all, we'll look at how a sense of three-dimensional space is achieved in a 2D format such as drawing or painting. Note that none of these methods for achieving 3D space can apply to sculpture in the round, which is inherently three-dimensional and does not need to give the illusion of space, because it exists in space. Let's start with modeling, which is building form illusionistically with lights and darks. It is the most basic means of achieving a 3D look. As you can see, the Mickey on the left is rather flat looking. Any sense of dimensionality comes from what our minds tell us a figure would be doing. We know he is standing up and that he occupies space. In the storyboard drawing for Mickey and Steamboat Willie on the right, the artist has included just a minimal amount of shading, but it gives him a better sense of volume. It's a fairly simple principle. The more modeling with lights and darks, the less flat the work looks, and the greater the illusion of volume. Foreshortening is another great way to convey a sense of depth. It works in two ways. First, the part of a figure or object that appears closer is larger, and the part that's farthest back appears smaller. In the image on the right, the hand is nearly blocking the entire head, although we know the boy's fist would not be as large as his head. Turning to the other drawing, you'll observe that certain objects or body parts, like a finger pointing straight at the viewer, might be too small to really render the tip noticeably larger than the base. However, what you don't want to do is make the mistake of making the finger as long as your brain knows the finger is. So the second way foreshortening works is that you have to reduce the amount of space the objects projected straight forward occupy visually. In this instance, the entire finger pointing forward occupies about as much space as one knuckle. Although foreshortening is based on a closer, farther principle, it doesn't just apply to what's forward and what's backwards. It can also be used to show figures or objects from an unfamiliar perspective. Here, we know the viewer is situated well below the standing figure since the legs are so much larger than the head. The more dramatic the foreshortening, the stronger the illusion of space we have. In fact, our Mickeys were all slightly foreshortened, since he was standing in a three-quarter view with his elbows out, rather than in a fully frontal view with his hands down by his sides. Of course, even when a human being is presented in a fully frontal view, the feet must be foreshortened unless the person is standing in ballet's first position. Let me be clear that foreshortening is not a drawing trick, so to speak, but how our eyes operate in real life. As such, a photograph will foreshorten the body if certain parts of the body are coming out towards you. However, I cannot emphasize enough that foreshortening applies only to 2D works of art, including photos, and you should never use this word in conjunction with sculpture. Students make this mistake quite often. In sculpture, something would literally project forward in actual space. It is not foreshortened. Foreshortening goes hand in hand with linear perspective. Linear perspective was officially discovered during the early Renaissance and allowed artists to create architectural vistas or put geometrical solids into a true receding space by determining at what angle the receding line should appear. Depending on your vantage point, you may have 1-point or 2-point perspective. In the Renaissance, there is commonly one vanishing point on the horizon line. Objects get smaller and smaller as they reach the horizon. We sort of know this, but there is a mathematical precision to linear perspective. It not only determines the angle of the lines, but also how long these lines should be, and no receding lines have an absolute width, only a width that's relative to the perspectival angle. For example, the facade of the building on the bottom is at an angle. Its greatest width is already shortened by this, but at the horizon, where the line can only be perfectly horizontal, it's also at its shortest. This is also the maximum pictorial width for the entire building. but any differences for angled lines are probably negligible. More pertinent is that from top to bottom of the picture plane, the facade is compressed into a very short distance. This is, in essence, the same thing as foreshortening, but in terms of hand drawing, it's much easier to do with geometric or simple shapes, and particularly cubes, than with organic shapes, such as human bodies. Having said that, the truth is you could situate a body or part of a body within a perspectival cube to see how this operates, but there isn't really a mathematical formula for the face. You just have to observe closely and figure out the proportions individually. Perspective isn't incredibly easy for the average drawer, and over the millennia, artists have found various ways of conveying space that speak more to what our brains know than how our eyes see. Overlapping is, of course, a naturalistic phenomenon, and it is an important and effective way to convey space. However, if there is only overlapping and no diminution of farther objects, then it's just a pictorial convention. Likewise, diminution and receding lines can be either mathematically accurate, following the rules of linear perspective and the idea of a vanishing point on the horizon, or they can be intuitive and subject to minor discrepancies. When there are major discrepancies and the intuition has either gone awry or the artist is just oblivious, then you might have divergent perspective. Here, there is an understanding that receding lines go back at an angle, but the orthogonals, or those imaginary lines that you can follow to the vanishing point, will not accord with one another and converge at the same vanishing point. Some artists have used placement, either vertical or diagonal, to suggest relative distance, but this is merely a pictorial convention. Atmospheric perspective, or aerial perspective, is another way to suggest distance. This is when objects become less distinct and less saturated with color as they get farther away. In general, there are other ways to make an artwork appear more lifelike or naturalistic, and only the first two apply only to painting. We talked about a realistic sense of space and how to achieve that pictorially. There are more ways to create atmospheric effects than aerial perspective, which is only applicable to things sufficiently set in the distance. One of the best ways to do so is to bathe the picture in a unified light, and of course, its subsequent shadows. Moonlight or firelight scenes often have a stronger sense of atmosphere, and you can see both in this 18th century painting by Vernet. Interior scenes by candlelight achieve this particularly well also. Most of the remaining means of imitating real life, for sculpture or for painting, have to do with overall accuracy. You want accurate or realistic proportions, anatomy, color, and so forth at the most basic level. But you also want realistic poses and gestures, realistic expressions, realistic actions with regard to the narrative, and realistic clothes and settings. These are accurate in a different way, and might also be called appropriate, since an expression or gesture doesn't have the same fixed quality as anatomy or proportions. The contrast I'm establishing here is that an artist could draw, paint, or sculpt a figure that is a 100% viable human in physical terms, but whose expression is just wrong for the narrative or feeling the artist is trying to convey. An artist could certainly also make the mistake of putting the figure in the wrong clothes or the wrong setting. For example, in this painting by Antonello da Messina, Saint Sebastian, although martyred in Roman imperial times, is shown in a Renaissance-era town square. The traditional biological model of art is one term for describing this increasing naturalism with regard to the representation of human figures over time. From left to right, you can clearly observe the increasingly naturalistic anatomy and proportions in these statues from various periods of ancient Greece. The same thing happens in painting, from the late 1200s to the High Renaissance, when artists were on a similar quest to reproduce real-life effects as closely as possible. Of course, in broad terms, this trend reversed over the course of the 19th century and into the early 20th century, so we moved towards greater abstraction. This deliberate abstraction is quite different from the simplified and schematic works that simply resulted from a lack of understanding about how to invest artistic images with realism. In the late 19th century, proportions were exaggerated and brushwork was loosened for expressive purposes. Formalism and expressionism had gained increasing importance by the time Matisse painted the famous green stripe in his portrait of his wife. One of the hallmarks of modernism for painting is that the flat surface regains pictorial prominence. By the 20th century, total abstraction was possible, but when using correct terminology, you should not confuse works that are abstract but still representational, as Derain's landscape on the left, with works that are abstract and non-representational, like Kandinsky's on the right. Such works are also called non-figurative or non-objective because they have no figures or objects. There are many terms for talking about the various aspects of realism, and you should be aware that while these words have a general meaning, they might often have a specific meaning in a historical context. For example, realism was a movement of the mid-19th century. Naturalism was a movement of the late 19th century. Usually these are stylized with a capital R or N to make the distinction. Even so, it may confuse you. In any case, you should be aware of some other specific types of realism. Photorealism is a term that is applied to paintings that are indistinguishable from a photograph due to the detailed realism. Of course, this applies only to the pictorial arts, as sculpture cannot approximate a photo. Hyperrealism is a synonym, also meaning extremely realistic. It is generally applied to sculpture that is meant to trick the viewer into thinking something is real, as in this sculpture by Duane Hansen. In painting, the term can be more connotative since the prefix hyper really means too much, and so hyperrealism might be applied to images that look like they have been studied under a microscope and/or are magnified to a very large scale. This is a detail from Antonello de Messina's Portrait of a Man, which is a small painting. In real life, we might not see every eyelash and other anatomical details of the eye with such clarity. Since the advent of digital photography, we have probably become accustomed to seeing unnaturally high-resolution images of ourselves, but the truth is that our eyes don't really experience people in that way in day-to-day life. Finally, we have trompe-l'œil, a French term that means trick the eye and is applied exclusively to the pictorial arts, since it refers to the idea that the eye is tricked into thinking the flat artwork is three-dimensional. In a way, it is the usage more than the terms themselves that has meaning, since as I noted, there are sculptures that are meant to trick you and others that are merely hyper-realistic. I'll point out the difference by making one final point about trompe-l'œil painting. The artwork must be rendered at the correct scale to effectively trick the eye, and you can really only fully appreciate it in real life. Trompe-l'œil paintings are often still lifes done to the correct scale, and Borel de Caso's painting of a boy emerging from the frame would have to depict a life-size child in order to have its full impact. At a smaller scale, it might be photo or hyper-realistic, but if we were to take it literally, it would look like a tiny elf. Same with Duane Reade's sculptures. If he created them with the same level of realistic detail, but at a reduced scale, set on a pedestal, your eye would never mistake them for a real person in a museum. As you can see, it's not that simple, and there will be a lot to discover and enjoy as you continue to explore the nuances of all these terms in your art classes. Before closing, I just want to underline the point that these terms describe the style of an artwork, and as such are used for formal analysis. If you want to discuss the subject matter or content, this is a study of iconography. The two can often be inextricably linked, as we saw with David's Oath of the Horatii, where the narrative and emotional content is reinforced by the formal choices of the artist. And when I was talking about appropriateness as opposed to accuracy, this was crossing the line into the realm of content, because you can formally analyze someone's clothing without giving any mind at all to whether it's accurate for the historical period or social milieu the artist is representing. A good visual analysis gives attention to both form and content, but you should be aware of the difference and you should be able to treat them separately.